So before I get started, right now there are pamphlets going around, or little brochures that I created, a little bit about my topic and the purpose of my topic. So you guys can take a look at that while I'm speaking also. Also, before I start, I would like to thank my mentor, Eric Brown, that's not here anymore. My faculty mentors, Dr. Keaton, who's sitting right over there, and Dr. Ron, who's sitting right over there. They've been amazing, very patient with me throughout this time. Okay. So to get a little bit of audience participation, I would like everybody in the room to raise their hands to see how much they know about child sexual abuse, which is basically going to be the topic of the discussion today. So how many of you all think child sex abuse affects about 500,000 people in America, in the U.S.? Raise your hand. 500,000? I'm going to keep going. So 500,000, a million, maybe 2 million, 2 million, 10 million. Anybody thinking more than that? All right. So just to blow you guys' mind, child sexual abuse actually affects 50 million people in the U.S. And that statistic is still on the rise today. So this is why I am doing my topic today on dissociative identity disorder and its prevalence in victims of trauma. All right, so my research question, the purpose of my research was to find a link between dissociative identity disorder and trauma. There's actually very little research done on this topic, a specific link, so I had to do a lot of piecing together with my data. All right, and I was able to do that through a literary review. I examined models that focused on small linkages between the two, dissociative identity disorder and trauma victims. I also examined treatment methods. I looked at autobiographical accounts from a personal friend of mine, as well as my supervisor, Diane Champagne, who is also a survivor of child abuse. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. She's having a much needed vacation right now. And then I also integrated 3 disciplinary perspectives: psychology, biology, and philosophy, which I'll discuss later in my presentation. Okay. So there are 2 different types of trauma. So understanding dissociative identity disorder, you have to understand trauma in order to see the linkage between the 2. So there's a non-medical and a medical definition of trauma. So for the purpose of my study, I focused on the non-medical definition of trauma, which was a behavioral state caused by stress. And understanding trauma a little bit more, I have a couple more statistics for you, just to give you an idea of how prevalent this issue is in our society. Abuse and neglect is about 10 times higher than the incidence rates for all forms of cancer. There was a report that stated there's about 1 reported rape or sexual assault every 107 seconds in our society. And then abuse is highest amongst children from birth to 12 years old. So the effects of trauma are as stated. It ranges from chronic headaches to dissociations. There are 3 different types of dissociation disorders. There's depersonalization disorder, which is basically, it's like a chronic daydream. So what this is, it's a frequent and severe feeling of detachment with reality. And then there's also dissociative amnesia and fugue, which is a chronic state of memory loss. So I always use the example of Breaking Bad, if any of you guys like Breaking Bad, when he goes through his fugue stage, quote unquote. That's an example of dissociative fugue, but it's actually real. It's not fake. People really don't know where they are, any of their surroundings, even their identity. But the one I decided to focus on was dissociative identity disorder. So dissociative identity disorder is a disruption in one's memory and perception in time and cognitive abilities, just like the other disorders. But the difference between DID and the other dissociative disorders is that 2 or more separate personalities may form to control a person's behavior. So there is actual evidence to support this, because when you say it out loud, it seems like, wow, people can form different personalities. That's kind of cool and also a little like strange. but there's actual proof that this is a real thing that happens to people. For example, like I stated, I used autobiographical accounts for this. Diane's personal experiences explain in detail in her book how she suffered through various dissociations throughout the day whenever she was triggered by any type of stressful stimuli. And Diane, her story, she was molested by her father from age 6 until she was 21 years old. So any little thing would trigger her dissociations, and she managed to form 22 different personalities. There are also neurological abnormalities that happen with DID. There are changes in the brain. A lot of people, I don't know if there are any science majors in here, but chronic stress can have some very significant effects on the brain. The same happens with DID. DID is also used as a coping mechanism, used to protect survivors from overwhelming amounts of stress. So Diane also stated that it was her way of coping with just day-to-day stressors that she couldn't handle, and she would flash back to her childhood memories. And another thing that distinguishes it is the fact that because of all this evidence, it's highly distinguishable between real DID and people that fake their symptoms. So because of these so-called fakers, there's a lot of controversy with this disorder, which is another reason why I decided to choose my research to focus on DIDs, because it's one of the most controversial mental diagnoses in the field still. There are two opposing models. The trauma model basically says, yes, there's enough evidence to prove that this is real. We're not ignoring the fact that people lie, but at the same time, it's not impossible for this to happen to somebody. But the fantasy model states, no, people that go through traumatic experiences, they're more likely to falsify their memories, or they're more prone to fantasy. And there are actual well-renowned psychologists and psychiatrists that actually believe this. There's an entire foundation called the False Memory Foundation that supports this theory and funds the research for this theory. And there's also, it kind of umbrellas the implanted memory theory, which states that physicians implant these memories into their patients, therefore they're falsified. So the reason why this is interdisciplinary is because I feel as though DID is a very complex disorder. In my research question, I was trying to see if there was a linkage between DID and trauma. So I was able to answer this question by integrating psychology, biology, and philosophy. I use the psychology because in human behavior, it's very complex. You obviously need to learn about psychology. It's a psychological disorder, and psychological interventions also play a key factor in the treatment. I use biology because you need to understand the mechanisms going on in the brain to understand how that's affecting behavior. And then I use philosophy to understand the mindset of the victim and how much abuse can warp their belief systems going forward into adulthood. So the integration strategies I use, there's a conflict between social science and biological sciences. So in order to find common ground between those conflicts, I use my declared major, which is neuropsychology, because it is the study of brain-behavior relationships. So I was able to find that common ground between the social and the biological to understand how that plays into behavior. And I also was able to, in my own way, redefine what health is, because I feel as though a lot of victims of this disorder and victims of trauma in general, they are very much stigmatized and they feel as though they can't receive help. So my idea with this was that we needed to redefine what health was. You can't only say, oh, like, I have a sore ankle or whatever, I should go see a doctor, but be ashamed to say, oh, you know, I am suffering from severe depression and anxiety, but everybody else thinks I'm crazy if I say something. So I extended the concept of health across all three of those disciplines, and I was able to redefine health in my my treatment suggestions that I'll talk about later. And also the most applicable integration strategy for me that I found in my research was to use building complex and multi-causal explanations, because DID is a complex disorder, trauma is a very complex concept, and I feel like it was just the most applicable thing and easiest thing for me to use in my research to apply to each one of those disciplines. For my treatment, so after my research, some of the treatment suggestions I could think of included trauma-informed care, which has been shown to be one of the most effective treatments to treat this disorder, because it understands the source of the problem and then it diagnoses and treats the problem, as opposed to the traditional human services model, which identifies the problem without really identifying the source of that problem. And then it diagnoses and treats it. So trauma-informed care treats the person as a person first, and then later takes care of the problem. Another treatment suggestion that I found, which also ties into my philosophy perspective, was the restructure of distorted beliefs. As I said, that could start back when the abuse started. I was able to find out that cognitive therapy and exposure therapies were very effective in doing this. I also found that stress management skills and techniques were also good treatment suggestions, because they use biological mechanisms to understand how to make a person feel better, especially when they're suffering through major depression symptoms. All right, so in conclusion, is there a link between dissociative identity disorder and trauma? I said yes, but there are gaps in the research, and I found that an interdisciplinary approach is needed to bridge those gaps. As I stated before, there wasn't a lot of research, so I had to do a lot of piecing together. There wasn't any specific site or article that was telling me, oh yes, absolutely, there's a definite link. It was more so like, yes, this could cause that, and that could cause this, but I was able to use other disciplinary perspectives to fill in those gaps, and I feel as though interdisciplinary approaches are the best way to go in order to advance this research in such a serious problem. Oh, go back. Good.
I'm not clear, I'm sure, why you're sure there's a link between trauma and dissociative identity disorder. I mean, what would you say is, what's a good piece of evidence? What's a piece of evidence that was convincing for you? You said, aha, that makes sense.
Oh.
There's this link.
I meant to state that the personal accounts that I was reading from Diane, that was probably my most important method that I found, because she's a real person that had that real diagnosis. So I didn't for one second think that she was making this up. And I also didn't believe that she was just using it to sell a book. Because I know her on a personal level. Also, I've been interning with her for a couple years now, and she's dedicated her life to helping adult survivors of child abuse, and she understands the struggle of people just not believing you. So that right there was a lot of proof for me, more so than a lot of the scientific journals that I was reading. Although those were a lot more objective, I felt as though that was pretty astounding, because I didn't know that was possible, at least to that magnitude. 22 personalities is a lot. So it made sense to me why those personalities were coming out at certain times of her life and how they were able to help her.
So you mentioned Diane, and so I put her in the survivor category, and she's amazing, and I met her at the benefit concert. But I'm interested in, I don't think you really went into detail or mentioned in your presentation who the main researchers and scholars are in this field. So who's writing about this, and what did you learn from some of the major thinkers, researchers in this field?
Well, that was the issue. There's none. There's a lot of, there's not even a lot of people talking about trauma-informed care. There's like a handful of people talking about trauma-informed care, and there's a handful of people that believe in the fantasy model, and then everybody else is kind of like, but we can see there's a difference. Other than that, there's no like leading person actually making major, I would say, research accomplishments that I could follow after. Like I said, everything I kind of had to piece together, especially when I was looking at the different models. There definitely were some people.
But those, I'm sorry to interrupt, but those models emerged from research, right? Like the trauma model, whose model is that?
The trauma-informed care model, I don't know where it began, if that's what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where it began. I know locally there are just some people that practice it more than others. Other than that, I don't know like the origin of it.
Where did you encounter it?
Working with Diane. So I created manuals, like training manuals for the board, the staff, and the volunteers for her nonprofit. And all of it was just full of trauma-informed care and non-violent communications, which I couldn't even touch on. My presentation really just skimmed the surface of like how deep this disorder is and how deep like the trauma is. But there's a bunch of different treatments that have been effective, especially for Diane. Diane was in treatment for like over 20 years. So there's a bunch of different treatment, but it's not like one single thing because everybody's different and everybody responds to different things. And I do know, I read that either some aspects of trauma-informed care might be too much for people because they have to recall a lot of the memories and sometimes it's just too overwhelming. So.
Okay, so I'm just going to tag on to what Professor Brown said about how you prove the link. So how would you substantiate, like through experimentation, that there is a link between, for example, neglect in the first year towards DID? I know that like neglect has been shown epigenetically to influence certain expressions of genes, but then how would you link that to the development of DID?
Link neglect to the development of DID.
Yeah.
I think the neglect has to be coupled with some type of abuse. I don't think the neglect by itself could automatically just create DID. I think if it's coupled with something, then it's a likelihood. It's no definite like this kid is absolutely going to develop DID. It's just there's a very high chance that they could because of their experience, their traumatic experience as a child.
But how would you link that experimentally? How would you design a way to prove the correlation, there is causation?
I mean, experimentally, the research that I've seen, at least like the biological empirical research, they did like a lot of scans, a lot of longitudinal studies just to follow people to see how their brains changed and how that would correlate to the same brain of somebody that was highly dissociative. And that's pretty much what I encountered with my research. It was just a lot of like comparison to healthy and quote unquote unhealthy individuals. So I don't know, did I answer your question a little bit? Okay. Oh, wait, sorry, Carrie.
So, as I understand it, I know that the DID isn't brand new. It's a new terminology because it was
Right.
multiple personality
Yeah.
disorder before. And from when I was in school and learning about it, they did have a lot of links back to a lot of sexual trauma. So when you mention trauma, are you really specifically, because you started off your presentation with childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah.
So are you specifically talking about that trauma, or are you
Yeah.
including any other kind of trauma that could have?
I was specifically narrowing down that type of traumatic experience
Okay.
because it has a pretty big impact.